Okay, so today we're diving into something that's, well, let's face it, not exactly a walk in the park, right? We're talking about divorce in Israel, but with a specific focus on the financial side of things.
Always a relevant topic,
It
unfortunately.
really is, and thankfully you send us some really useful materials to help us understand this stuff, and of course we've got our expert here to help us break it all down.
Happy to be here.
Perfect. One of the sources you sent over, it's an article from a law firm, Batari, Lieberman, Kimiyagaroff, and they specialize in divorce law, actually. Anyway, they said something in this article that I thought was really interesting. Everyone talks about the emotional toll of divorce, which, yeah, absolutely, but they pointed out that the financial part can be just as rough.
Yeah, it's easy to overlook that side of it, but it's a huge factor.
Totally. And this article, I mean, it's not sugarcoating anything. It comes right out and says that, yeah, divorce in Israel can be expensive.
No, it definitely can be.
But it's not all doom and gloom. The article also pushes back on this idea that it's always going to cost you an arm and a leg.
Right. There's this misconception that you need like a winning lottery ticket just to get started. This article does a good job, though, of laying out all the different costs, and actually it gives some decent advice about keeping those costs under control.
Right on. Well, let's get into some of those hidden costs this article mentions, because, I mean, it's not just the lawyer's fees, right?
No, there's a lot more to it. It's easy to forget about things like the court fees, for example.
Yeah.
And then, if things get really messy, you might end up having to hire a private investigator,
Yeah.
which that adds up. And even something like mediation, which is supposed to be a way to simplify things, that costs money too.
Oh, for sure. It's like when you're planning a wedding, suddenly, bam, all these unexpected expenses come out of nowhere. And speaking of making smart decisions, the article also had this interesting bit about where you hire your lawyer. They specifically talked about Tel Aviv versus Beersheba. What's the deal with that?
It is kind of a curious point, isn't it? I mean, you wouldn't think that someone's legal expertise would change that much just because they're in a different city.
Hmm.
But they say that going with a lawyer in Tel Aviv, that could actually cost you like double what you'd pay in Beersheba.
Wow, really? So are Tel Aviv divorce lawyers like twice as good?
That's a good question. And I mean, the article doesn't really get into that level of detail. What they do mention, though, is that lawyers who are outside those big city centers, they can usually keep their operating costs lower. Like, think about things like rent and support staff. Those are going to be more expensive in a place like Tel Aviv, and obviously those costs, they get passed on to the clients.
So it's kind of like choosing between, a fancy coffee shop and then just your regular corner place. You might be paying extra for the atmosphere and the location as much as for the coffee itself. But, okay, even when you factor in those big costs, like your lawyer's fees and where they're based, this article is saying that there's all this other stuff that can pop up and add to the bill, right?
Yeah, and that's something a lot of people don't realize until it's too late. The article calls them additional discussions, but basically what they're talking about is any extra hearings or court appearances that come up that weren't part of the original plan.
Okay, so that's like what? Like when you're renovating your house and then halfway through, the contractor tells you the whole place needs to be rewired.
That's a good way to put it. Those kinds of surprises can really throw a wrench in your budget. And this article, they say these additional discussions, they can cost you anywhere from like 1,000 shekels to over 3,000 shekels each time. It all depends on how complicated the issue is and how long it takes to deal with. And a lot of times, these extra meetings, they happen because some new problem pops up that nobody saw coming.
Like what? Can you give me an example?
Sure, imagine, like, one spouse is being shady and trying to hide assets. Or maybe there's a big disagreement about how the child custody arrangements are going to work. Stuff like that. That usually means more work for the lawyers. They might have to bring in expert witnesses or file motions, and all of that just means more meetings and more costs.
You just mentioned motions. Can you explain what that means, for those of us who haven't been through the whole divorce process?
Oh, right, yeah. Basically, a motion is just a formal request that gets made to the court. It could be anything from asking the court to make a ruling about, say, who gets temporary custody, or it could be asking them to make the other side hand over financial records, things like that. And usually, whenever you file a motion, it means there's going to be a hearing about it, and that means more time with your lawyer and probably more court fees.
Got it. Okay, so if trying to be on the same page with your ex as much as possible is like step one, which is probably way easier said than done, what are some other things someone could do to avoid some of these hidden costs? What should they be thinking about?
Honestly, I think the biggest thing is just making sure you choose the right lawyer. And I know that sounds obvious, but it makes a huge difference. The article doesn't come right out and say this, but I think what they're getting at is just the importance of good communication with your lawyer right from the start.
So don't be afraid to, like, really grill them during those first few meetings.
Exactly. You really got to be your own advocate. Don't be shy about asking them about their experience. Have they handled cases similar to yours before? Especially if you know there are going to be disagreements about dividing assets or custody. You want someone who's been there, done that, someone who can spot potential problems and give you good advice.
So basically, it's better to be safe than sorry. Don't just sit back and hope for the best. Be proactive.
100%. And, another thing, don't be afraid to talk about money up front. Like, really get into the nitty-gritty of their fees. What's included, what's not included? What are some common situations that might lead to extra charges? Just having those honest conversations right at the beginning, it can save you a lot of stress and surprises down the road.
That's great advice. And you know what? It's funny. The article spends all this time going over all these potential problems, but then it actually ends on a pretty positive note. They give these 4 takeaways, almost like a roadmap for getting through this whole process.
Oh yeah, those takeaways are really useful. Do you mind if I hear them?
Not at all. So takeaway number 1, and I know we keep coming back to this, but seriously, try to work things out with your ex as much as you can. Even agreeing on the small stuff can make a big difference in the long run.
Totally. It's like they say, choose your battles. Not only will it help keep the legal costs down, but it can also help you, salvage some kind of working relationship, which is especially important if you have kids together.
Right, for sure. Okay, so takeaway number 2 is shop around when you're looking for a lawyer. Don't just go with the first one you find online or who your friend's uncle recommended. Do your homework.
Yeah, just because a lawyer has higher fees, it doesn't automatically mean they're the best. Take your time, research different options, read reviews, and actually meet with a few different lawyers before you make a decision.
Makes sense. Okay, what was number 3?
Number 3 is think seriously about mediation. Sometimes having that neutral third party there, it can really help. And not just with the financial side of things, it can be really good for everyone emotionally too.
Right, it's like having a referee to keep things from getting out of hand.
Exactly. And, a lot of times going through mediation means you're more likely to end up with an agreement that actually works for everyone long term.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with really personal issues like custody schedules. And of course, from a purely practical standpoint, it's usually a lot cheaper than fighting it out in court.
Okay, so what about their last piece of advice? What's their final takeaway?
They just say, don't be afraid to look for help. There are a lot of organizations out there that offer legal aid and support for people who need it, so don't be afraid to reach out and see what's available.
That's a good reminder. You don't have to go through this alone.
For sure. There are places that can help with legal stuff, emotional support, even financial assistance sometimes. Just got to know where to look.
Right. Like they always say, knowledge is power. And sometimes the most important knowledge is knowing where to find help when you need it.
And speaking of knowledge, yeah, it's interesting. We've been talking a lot about, the nuts and bolts of divorce in Israel, like the financial stuff. But like you said earlier, that's not the whole picture, is it?
No, definitely not. I mean, this article, it's great. Don't get me wrong. It gives you all these practical details about the financial side of things, which is super important. But it doesn't really address the emotional impact, and that can be huge.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even if you manage to avoid like a big legal battle and keep things civil with your ex, divorce is still a really emotional thing to go through. It is. And the thing is, you can't put a price on emotional well-being. It sounds cheesy, but honestly, taking care of yourself emotionally during a divorce, that's an investment. Like it might mean going to therapy or maybe finding a support group or even just trying mediation that focuses more on communication skills, just to help you and your ex deal with conflict better.
Right. So it's about the long game, really. Taking care of your mental health now, that's going to pay off later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you can learn some healthy coping skills and ways to communicate better, that's not just going to help you get through the divorce. It can help you with like everything, especially if you have kids and you're going to be co-parenting.
That's so true. It's about more than just, surviving the divorce. It's about giving yourself the tools to actually move on and build a good life afterwards.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's important to say this too. Asking for help, whether it's from a therapist or a support group or whatever, that's not a sign of weakness. It takes a lot of courage to admit you need help, and it shows that you're taking care of yourself.
Yeah. It's about taking control, because during a divorce, it can feel like everything is completely out of control. Well, this has been, wow, really eye-opening. We've covered so much ground. We talked about all those hidden costs that come with divorce in Israel, what can make those costs go up, and most importantly, what people can do to protect themselves. But if there's one thing I want everyone to remember from this whole conversation, it's this. Yes, learn everything you can about the financial side of divorce. Be prepared. But don't forget to take care of yourself emotionally, too. That's just as important, if not more.
Couldn't agree more. Taking care of yourself financially and emotionally, that's how you get through this. Remember, you're not alone. A lot of people have been through this, and they've come out stronger on the other side.
Such an important message. Thank you so much for being here. Your insights have been amazing. And for everyone listening, remember, knowledge is power, and hopefully this deep dive has given you the knowledge you need to face whatever challenges come your way. We'll see you next time. Okay, so today we're diving into something that's, well, let's face it, not exactly a walk in the park, right? We're talking about divorce in Israel, but with a specific focus on the financial side of things.
Always a relevant topic,
It
unfortunately.
really is, and thankfully you send us some really useful materials to help us understand this stuff, and of course,